Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on culture and ideas with a special focus on education, the arts, and social change. And we have the great delight to be here in the Upper East Side Gallery of Graham Arader, the legendary art world maestro, who has the largest collection of prints of John James Audubon, who was America's first great naturalist, one of the great artists who has been so sort of part of the cultural scene that we've kind of taken him for granted, and I think is maybe due for a renaissance due to the environmental movement that's going on and the back to nature that people are talking about. So here we are with Graham's assistant, Mr. Michael Foley, who was one of the leading experts in the world on John James Audubon, and we're going to get to know Michael. We're going to get to know something about Arader Galleries and what's going on here in this beautiful palace on Madison Avenue. For us, it's such a treat because we're always trying to educate our audience about art and about the intricacies of the art world and the vocabulary so that people, average people, can appreciate art more when they look at a piece and they don't know what they're looking at. And so here we're going to get our basic John James Audubon 101. We're going to get a little bit of an introduction to the world of Graham Arader, but we're going to start with Michael Foley and just to introduce yourself to our show and to our audience and to the world. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Michael. And let's start with John James Audubon. Who was he, and why does he still matter?
Well, thank you very much, John. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak here. Particularly, I'm grateful to Graham, too, for giving me the opportunity. And I know that you guys are going to follow up at some stage when he's available to really get the Graham Arader story, which is far more interesting than the Michael Foley story. But there are a few stories more interesting than that of John James Audubon. And here we are on the 3rd of July. Audubon is really one of the great American artists, in many ways a great American naturalist, and even a great American folk hero. People who love his work love the story of John Audubon as much as they love the work almost, because it's one of those improbable things that really shouldn't have happened. It was John James Audubon, like a lot of great Americans, was not born here. He was born a Frenchman, born down in the island of what's now Haiti. He grew up in Nantes in France, and then basically to escape Napoleon's draft, was sent by his father to a farm in Pennsylvania, not too far from Philadelphia. That's where he developed an early passion for birds, but he didn't pursue it until he was in middle age. He was in Henderson, Kentucky. He had lost his business. He had lost a daughter. He had a wife and 2 children, no prospects, no money. And he decided to do the most improbable thing he could have picked, which was to make the largest, most expensive, most accurate color plate book of birds ever produced. And he did.
Wow. And then he came to New York and he went to a place called Washington Heights that has an avenue named after him called Audubon Avenue, where my mother was born. Absolutely, was born on Audubon Avenue. He was, as you said, we were talking earlier, very much a scientist as well as an artist. He wanted to sort of really show the birds and what they look like. But how did that tension play out between the science and the art in his life?
That's a great question, because Audubon was one of those breakthrough people in both fields, both in natural history and in art. Before Audubon, there were lots of artists who were trying to capture birds in a scientific way, to depict them in a way that scientists could compare them and classify them. In the 19th century, classifying nature was a strong motivator behind all science. And Audubon broke through that, because before him, the images of birds were all static. They were based on the anatomy of the bird. Each bird was pictured sitting on a branch, roughly identical in posture, in shape. What Audubon did as a naturalist and as an artist was to break through that and treat the birds as living creatures, to show them in their habitat, in their lifestyle, the way they fed, the way they argued, the way they mated, the way they made their nests. And he captured the actual activity of these birds in a way that had never been done before.
Well, if you look behind us, folks, you'll see that these are not static-looking birds. You know, they're very much in action. You know, my wife, Claudia, who's filming us now, she's from South America. She has an indigenous background, and she's very in touch with nature. And she will point out to me things that I don't even know, like, look at that bird over there, look at that squirrel. There is a kind of consciousness of nature, of being aware of it or not aware of it. Now, of course, there's a big movement towards, you know, nature, and we have to protect our environment and save our environment. Do you think that Audubon could play a role in this, in terms of the environmental movement? And because he was an early ecologist, would you say?
I think he was perhaps the first American ecologist in the truest sense of the word, to the extent that he really studied the behavior of the birds. He was criticized for it as a scientist in his day, because his approach wasn't accepted by the mainstream of scientists. They were concerned with anatomical relationships rather than lifestyle relationships. Not all of them. There were those who supported him, but in the main, he was a breakthrough, and breakthrough naturalists or artists often struggle, I think, when they first get their message out, and Audubon certainly did that. But he was an early understander of the ecology of birds. He was very early to understand the impact of the environment on bird populations. He was sophisticated in the sense that he knew that the habitat was everything for bird populations. And by the time he got to his older years, he looked around and he said, I've seen America change so much. I've seen it change from wilderness to farms. He didn't even really see the next big shift from farms to cities and to suburbs. But even at that early stage, he saw the differences it was making to the birds and their successes.
Let's talk a little bit about Graham Arader also, because Graham, in terms of the role he has played in Audubon and bringing Audubon back, because he did something remarkable for maps. You know, he put antiquarian maps on the map, literally single-handedly, and with his passion, you know, with his enthusiasm for the work. Audubon himself was very passionate and enthusiastic about birds and about his work, and so there's that enthusiasm that's I think so essential to be successful in anything in life. You know, what was the role of Graham Arader in terms of the Audubon revival that's going on?
Well, Graham is, I think, most famous for his contributions to the map trade. He really revolutionized the sale of antique maps in this country and elsewhere. That's how he and I met, because I've always had a passion for history and for maps, and we spent long periods of time just talking about them, and he educating me as to what I was looking at and why it was so important. But he took it to the next step, because the expansion of cartography during the 16th through the 19th centuries, which is the area that we focus on, was accompanied by this move to explore. The move was to explore America, South and North America, to explore Asia, to explore the Pacific. And so much of that exploration was motivated by desire to understand the natural world. The explorers routinely took naturalists with them, they took artists with them, and they sent back images and samples of the bird life, the animal life, the botanical life that they were discovering in these places. And Graham realized early on that there was this close relationship between the cartography of this era that we're talking about and the other beautiful artistic images that were coming back and being created that displayed the natural world that was being discovered. So it was not a very long step from there to John James Audubon, because he in many ways was the pinnacle of the natural history illustrator, at least in North America. So there was a close relationship that Graham perceived early on. It's reflected in a separate passion he has, and that is for the collection of natural history watercolors. Most artists, including Audubon, worked in the natural world, principally in watercolor. Not so much in oils like in other areas, but watercolor was the chosen medium because it was portable, because it was quickly, you could use it quickly, and you could do fine gradations and subtleties of the natural world relatively quickly. And Graham has amassed the world's finest collection of the original watercolors of natural history subjects in the world, particularly botanical and also ornithological watercolors. He has over 10,000 pieces that he's collected in the course of building the map trade. So he's a multidimensional guy, but all of his passions all intersect, and it's clear the links between them, and it's great excitement to share with it.
Well, you know, I felt like a little bit of an explorer myself when I stumbled into here, this place, this magical place, about 3 months ago, completely by serendipity. But yet, I was on my way to the Metropolitan Museum for a workshop of the Maxine Greene Institute. Now, who was Maxine Greene? She was one of the greatest philosophers of education who ever lived. She put aesthetic education on the map. She felt that in schools that we should be educating about art. And she was my mentor. I used to go to salons in her Upper East Side apartment on Fifth Avenue. She lived to be 96 years old. I was 37 when we met. She was 83, and she lived to be 96. But anyway, Maxine Greene, it was because of that mission, that aesthetic education mission, that I found myself uptown. I got here a little early. So I said, let me just walk around, and then all of a sudden I see this museum, and I said, being nosy, I poked my head in, and voila, it's like this cabinet of curiosities, this incredible world. And we just want to bring our audience along for the ride and really show it. Because one of the things we talk a lot about in our show, Michael, is how we don't like what's happening in universities, the movement away from the humanities. We think art and humanity should be central. And Graham himself has been quite a philanthropist in helping universities. As an adjunct professor, I applaud that, and I think that's wonderful. But what about the role of the arts and aesthetic education? What do you think that is in our country right now?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and it comes to the core of what people like Audubon were doing. They didn't see this distinction. In earlier eras, I don't believe they saw a great distance between the arts and the sciences, what we would now call the humanities. If you go back far enough, scientists called themselves natural philosophers, and that sort of sums up how they saw the relationship between the two fields. People jumped back and forth between them. Audubon was a good example. He was intensely proud of his accomplishments as a scientist. When he became elected to some of the major scientific institutions or organizations in the world, he would immediately add those credentials to his prints. You know, he was showing people that, look, I'm a real scientist. I'm accepted by the Royal Society and others, the Linnaean Society. But he didn't see any distinction between that role and the informational role. His role as an artist was to capture the behavior and the accuracy and the real life of the bird and convey it to the public in a way that excited and intrigued them. And he didn't see any big distinction between those two roles. He saw them as related to one another. And certainly we would all love to see that happening in college and all higher education institutions. Graham has done wonderful things with universities throughout the country to try to basically put the natural history art of the last 3 centuries in front of students on a daily basis. Not locked away in a cupboard, not in the special collections portion of the library, but on the walls where people can see them, think about them, and make these connections for themselves.
Wow. Well, we're going to take a walk around in just a moment and take a look at some of these works and get up close and get some real reflection from you and some analysis so that our audience can learn what to do when we look at a work of art, how to think about it, how to talk about it. But before we get to that, what's also very important is you, Michael, and we want to get a little bit of Michael Foley 101, Michael Foley for Dummies. Who is Michael Foley, and how did you come to this work in terms of your own intellectual development, you know, growing up? Give us a little synopsis of your own life story.
Oh, goodness. Well, my background was a little different in that my father was, for 35 years, a professional with the Central Intelligence Agency. So we were stationed overseas for most of my childhood. I was born in Washington, D.C., but all my siblings were born elsewhere, either in Europe or Asia. And that gave us an interesting, and I think, a beneficial perspective on many things. I enjoyed it. It was exciting to see foreign countries, and I've continued a passion for travel and the study of travel and exploration that led me into the rare map field, which led me to Graham. So I think that the world is an endlessly fascinating place. I've always thought that, and I was fortunate to bump into a guy like Graham who lives that dream. I took a detour. I'm what my friends would call a recovering lawyer. I had a
Good.
I had a practice with a very fine New York upstate-based law firm and had a terrific career there. But when Graham and I really got down to talking deeply about how rewarding this field is, it just sort of triggered something in me, and I said, you know, I can do this. I have 2 wonderful children who are fully grown and successful. I have a wife who's very understanding and has a successful career of her own, so I got green lights all the way and made the change about 8 or 9 years ago.
And you're so patient and kind in the way you explain things in a very patient, way, very calmly. And do you give lectures? Have you developed as an educator? How did you become? Because I see you as an art educator. How did that process take place?
I love to talk. I love to lecture on this material. I love to share my enthusiasm for it. And usually the problem is getting me to shut up, So, yeah, I have given lectures. Most recently, I gave a talk to the International Society of Appraisers down in Louisville, Kentucky, which was great fun. And, of course, Audubon has deep roots in Kentucky. He lived in Henderson. He lived in Louisville. He drew many of his birds there. And they have a deep and abiding passion for the man and his work. Henderson, Kentucky, I'll do a shout out to there, has a fabulous museum on a state park there devoted to Audubon. So if anybody finds themselves in that part of the world, I strongly recommend they go. But in terms of lecturing, it's a pleasure. It's what I get to do when people come into the gallery. People are very familiar with Audubon as a name. They know he's the bird guy.
Yes.
They know, of course, of the National Audubon Society, which was named in his honor, but not by him. He had passed quite some years before that organization was formed. But most people don't realize exactly what a breakthrough naturalist and a breakthrough artist he was. And until they see these aquatint engravings in person, where they've only seen reproductions of the work in smaller scale perhaps, they really don't understand how brilliant his art form is.
But just briefly, what about New York? I mean, he lived here. He was up in the Heights. Could you see? Is New York doing enough to honor this man?
Oh, I think it'd be hard to do enough. He's a huge character. The wonderful people at the New York Historical Society do a fabulous job. To our great good fortune, Mrs. Audubon sold all of John's original watercolors after his death, intact. And they're all under the careful curation of the people at the New York Historical Society. And they have an ongoing exhibit there on the second floor where they quite artfully put together an original bound set of Audubon, the Birds of America, the copper plate itself where they can find it, and so you can see the technology, if you will, behind the making of these prints. The small octavo version, which was a smaller scale edition of the book that was put out by the Audubon family after the big birds, and other memorabilia that relate to John that put the work into context. So they do a wonderful job, and every couple years they do an exhibit, a large exhibit of his watercolors. The City Audubon organization, New York City Audubon, has a wonderful project where they're hiring contemporary artists to do Audubon-inspired work throughout the city. So you can go throughout the city and see large-scale mural work that is inspired by John Audubon, and it's very, very exciting to see that.
Well, before we take the tour of the room and look at some of the work, let's take a look at the pieces that are right here behind us. What's going on with this very dramatic-looking piece? There's a turtle there, there's a bird in the air coming down, and what's actually happening right here?
Well, this is a pinnated grouse, which is an original print by Audubon's engraver, Robert Havel Jr., printed in London between 1827 and 1838. And this is a classic example of Audubon doing a narration. He's telling a story about the behavior of these birds. In this case, this is part of the mating ritual of this particular bird. And these are two male birds that are competing for the attention of the female bird.
I thought that was a turtle. It's actually a female bird down there. Okay.
That is very much the female bird.
Maybe that's a female hiding, looking like it's hiding like under a turtle shell, but no, it looks like, yeah, okay.
Well, she is keeping her head down, wondering which way this little drama is going to end up. This fellow here seems to...
Chivalry is not dead in Audubon's world, okay.
Well, that's very astute, because in his writings, Audubon describes bird behavior in very human terms, and he was a highly romantic character. Perhaps being French was part of that, but he described birds' behavior in very human, romantic terms, and he would talk about courtship, not mating. That was the way he approached this. But this is clearly a situation where two male birds are competing in the way that they do over the attentions of the female.
Now, why don't we just simply stand up and look at this lovely print here of a family, a little more domestic a scene here of a mom with her chicks. And what kind of birds are these? And is that the mother and father?
Yeah, this is another grouse, and as you know, we didn't arrange it this way intentionally, but this could be almost the after scene where the drama below has played out, and there's a mating pair of birds, and of course the chicks have arrived. So Audubon was fascinated with the little baby animals, these baby birds, and his treatment of them is some of the most charming of all of his artworks. This is
the Father Knows Best version of, okay.
Yeah, that might be it. Right? That's pretty much it. Okay. This particular example is also a nice homage, if we will, to Havel, the engraver, who probably doesn't get the credit he should. Audubon, towards the end of his project, would devote intense amounts of attention to accurately depicting the birds, but he was pressed for time. He was trying to produce 435 of these plates, and he was trying to produce them in response to people who had subscribed to the series. And so by the end, he trusted Havel a great deal, and he would put the birds in the original watercolor, and then he would say to Havel, add the landscape here. Put rocks here, moss here, and he would give a great deal of discretion to this other artist. So it was a great collaboration, and I think this particular plate is a good example of that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Michael, what about these ducks over here? I was sitting over here by the ducks. Let's take a look at the ducks. Are they ducks? Am I saying it right? Or maybe they're not?
Actually what are called divers. We often would refer to these as loons. These are these wonderful birds that you hear in northern waters that give the very plaintive cry in the early evening and early morning.
With Henry Fonda. What was the movie?
On Golden Pond. Okay, that's the sound.
Okay.
And this is, again, a family grouping. You've got a young bird here, a juvenile bird here, and you've got the male and female associated with it as well. And Audubon is doing science here as well as making a graceful and attractive composition. Because he's trying to show you the difference between the male and the female birds, and then the difference in the plumage of the juvenile birds, so that if you're a birder or if you're a naturalist and you see one of these birds in the wild, you've got an idea of what species you're dealing with and whether it's a male, female, or whether it's a juvenile. But he's also doing wonderful art. The way he gracefully combines the lines of the bird on the left with the foliage in the background is thoughtful. It's all intentional. It comes across as being very natural and appealing, but it's very carefully thought out. He was brilliant at composing things. Havel, his engraver, again to nod out to him, developed this masterful way of engraving water. He needed a technique that would allow the bird realistically to look like it was floating on the water. The water has to be solid enough to support the bird, yet you have to be able to see through it to see the shape of the bird and the shape of his feet and so forth. So that was Havel's challenge, and I think he did a brilliant job in this particular engraving. One other point about this engraving that I think it's worth pointing out, because we've got these next to each other. Most of the ones that we have hanging in this room.
I love the yellow flowers over here too.
Aren't they magnificent?
Yeah. He was good with color. You said these are watercolor. They're not
These are watercolor put over an engraving. It was a very complex process that they used. They did a copper plate etching engraving with aquatint, which is a very sophisticated way of producing a very subtle black and white print. And then a hand colorist would apply the color on top of the black and white print. So each one of these is a hand-colored aquatint engraving.
Wow.
But most of them are from a single set that we acquired that has a single provenance going back to the early 1900s, family in Cleveland, Ohio. And they've been beautifully preserved, and they were obviously intended for a very, very special customer or subscriber, because the color on this set is literally as good as we've ever seen on any set of Audubons. And so to compare them with what is typically on the market, including ones that we sell, is really illuminating. In this case, we've got the loons here, which came from a different origin. This is not part of the same set. It's a lovely example. You'll be pleased and proud to sell it and to own it. But over the course of its life, it's been exposed to light, and the greens in the foliage have migrated more to blue. They've become that happens when it's exposed to ultraviolet light. The blossoms have faded somewhat. Some of the plumage has faded somewhat. And overall, the impression has a slight feeling of flatness, of not, a lack of depth. Whereas you look at this one with exquisite color that's not been exposed during its life to light, and you can see the much richer saturation of color. The lack of fading has left the greens still vibrant and fully green. And you get a real sense of depth. You have an illusion of distance in the background that it relies on color. Once that color fades, you lose that three-dimensionality. So we were so thrilled to get this set. It's very, very beautiful.
Wonderful. I just want to look at this owl for a second, because Graham was very busy, but he came in earlier and he showed us that the owl, something about the gradations of brown, that's very significant. What was he talking about, the brown?
Again, we can only conclude that this was a set that was produced in response to a subscription by someone very, very special, because where many plates would simply have 1 or 2 or 3 shades of brown applied to the bird's back and wings, in this case there are many, many, many different shades. There's a range of shades, subtly modulated shades of brown and tan and cream and a little bit of gray. And the result is just a far richer, more complex, and more realistic depiction of the animal. It's a really extraordinary example. It's also a really fun example. This is a very popular print, the barred owl. People love the fact that the squirrel is sitting there. It's uncertain whether the squirrel is going to be prey or not to this predator. But this is an interesting reflection of the way these were produced, because in the original watercolor that was the basis for this print, there's no squirrel. And Havel suggested to Audubon, John, why don't you put a squirrel there to add some drama, to add a narrative? And that's what happened, and that's what's in the final print.
Wow, we're all going to have a PhD in John James Audubon, folks, all of us, you watching us here. Let's just move around the space, Claudia. We just want to show the bigness of the space here. If we move the camera, follow us, my darling wife, Claudia Canasto, Chibuki from South America. And without her love, the show would be impossible. So I always like to say love is the answer. Love is always the answer. Paulo Freire was a great philosopher of education from Brazil who said we need to teach for a world in which it's easier to love. And we try to do that, and we think art and nature is also very loving. And so now we're in this incredible dynamic space on Madison Avenue, the epicenter of John James Audubon in the United States in terms of his prints, maybe in the world, and with Michael Foley. And Michael, you just look around the room, and whatever catches your eye, whatever you think is meaningful that needs to be shared with our audience, I'm going to let you run the show. Here.
Well, thank you very much. As I mentioned, this set of Audubons that we applied, it was not a full set. There are 435 plates in the great book of Birds of America, and we had something around 200 of them made available to us, all from the same collection. And it's just extraordinarily exciting for us in this world to have so many prints available to us at the same time for us to see and enjoy and compare and talk about. There are those in the world who have the privilege of owning full sets of Birds of America, still bound. There are about 125 of those out there in the world. Most of them are institutions, but there are private individuals who own them as well. And it's an extraordinary experience to turn the pages of this enormous book and look at the natural world through the eyes of a person in the 19th century. And that's what Audubon was doing. He was trying to take the Birds of America, everything he knew about these animals, and present them to people throughout the world. It's important to note that his principal and primary audience at first was in Europe, not in North America. He went to Edinburgh, Scotland, he went to London, he went to Paris. I like to say...
microphone close enough, honey, to make sure? Okay, yeah. All right, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the reminder.
First time on television?
It is.
Ah, that's a big one. You're a natural. You're a natural.
Thank you very much.
You might just go to Hollywood after this.
These guys make it very, very easy and fun.
Okay.
But what strikes me as I look through this entire collection is the incredible diversity of the bird world, and that's part of what intrigued and drove Audubon to do this incredible project. He knew these animals intimately from the field, and he wanted to try to convey them in all of their diversity, all of their incredible behavior, and also their settings, their place in the natural world. In some cases, he puts them in a specific locale where he identifies it. You know, in one case, he puts a bird in Key West, Florida. In another case, he puts it in Baltimore or Charleston, places that he had an affinity for. And others are more generic because he's trying to show the type of environment the bird lives in. For example, these two...
Blue jays?
No, they're looking at these little...
What are they called?
It's a marsh hen right here.
A marsh hen.
That's a marsh hen.
All right,
So
okay.
here it is on a mud bank.
Yes.
Basically hiding in the weeds, which is the way that bird operates.
Okay.
It's a bird that feeds off of small shellfish and things in the mud. It has that nice long beak that it'll poke down into the mud in the brackish water to find its food.
Okay.
So Audubon poses these birds in that setting, and he uses the opportunity to show that this is a shy bird. He's got it within the background of greenery to show that this is not a bird that's out there. Compare, for example, this little petit caporal, right? This is a small hawk or falcon.
Yes.
And that's a bird that is a predator. They're not afraid of much. And so he poses him out on this
Tough cookie.
on this post with a real attitude. I think it's fair to say that little guy is not afraid of much, and that's the way Audubon has portrayed him. So each of these has its story to tell about the animal, and sometimes about Audubon himself and how he experienced them.
Well, I always like to call myself a recovering shy person, but you know, through good education and the love of a wonderful wife, you know, you develop your confidence. But I tell you right now, I am so ready for my next dinner party. If anybody brings up Audubon, I'm there, baby. I am so ready. This is amazing. Now, you know what we should do now? I think it would be a good idea to bring in some of the crew, some of the team. We can get a little dialogue going here to find out who else puts this together, this operation. And okay, Michael, why don't we do that?
Let me do that. It'll take me 5 minutes.
Good, okay. Okay, so here we are with Erik and Annie at Arader Gallery. They really make things happen here. They make the magic happen, and we're going to get their story. We're going to get a little bit about how they contribute to this incredible place. And we'll start with Erik. And Erik, I hear that you're into rare books. Is that your background, specialty area? And also Americana. We could talk a little bit about that and introduce yourself.
That's correct. So my name's Erik. I've had a long-standing interest in American graphics, primarily produced before 1900, and that includes both graphics that have been bound into books, like you might see in natural history or atlases, as well as individual plates that might be such as broadsides or some other things, or maps that were issued individually. So it kind of runs the gamut.
Wonderful. I love to look at these works, when you see these old-timey kind of things, Norman Rockwell-esque, even for advertisements, they're just beautiful. They're gorgeous things to look at, yes. And now we're going to pass it on to Annie and introduce yourself to our audience and talk a little bit about your work.
Sure. My name's Annie. I work here primarily in the auction department. And what we're trying to do here, we run probably 6 or 7 auctions a year. And we accept consignments from all over the world, all over the country, and just trying to first get some of the material that we see here to a broader audience. And also, I think there's a growing amount of this material that builds up with collectors who are a little older, and they're people, especially my age, who don't really know what to do with it. So we're trying to provide kind of an outlet to market that. Yeah.
Just to say how I consider the art world such a magical place, such a privileged and special place, and just to be here, a part of it, even just making the show is incredible. But it's wonderful for our audience, and especially our young people, to know that this world exists, and to know that they could do things with their lives that are meaningful. So it's always good to show young people like who went for a dream, who didn't just study business, make a living, and whatever. Talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about growing up and what brought you to the arts.
Wow, that's a very good question. Lack of a business degree, maybe? Look, at the end of the day, you want to go home and feel like you've done something that's rewarding and you're actually engaged. And it's even better if at the end of each day you can say, well, I learned something new today that I didn't know. And I think that, at least for me, that's a really big part of it, and that keeps me going.
Where'd you grow up, Erik?
Outside of Boston.
Now Boston area is a very intellectual place too. A lot of great universities, a lot of museums.
We also got great accents up there as well.
One of my favorite philosophers, Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, is from there, and he said, "Whosoever is a man must be a nonconformist." That's always been one of my favorite quotes. Yes. And Annie, what is it that brought you to the art world? Was it from growing up? Was there a particular person in your family? Maybe was it your school? Was it tell that story?
Well, I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. So Jeffersonian, grew up with a lot of history, just having Monticello and Montpelier and Ashland in my backyard was definitely fundamental in my history interest. But they also say, those who can't do teach, those who can't draw sell art. So my interest in art was always I couldn't really do the actual physical work of art, but so I was always interested in the history. So I went to the University of Virginia and I studied art history and medieval history, and finding a place like this was just the combination of everything, and just knowing that there are so many amazing institutions around the world that have this type of combination. It's not just landscapes, it's not just oil paintings, there are maps and there's history in art. Was really a huge eye-opening experience for me.
They say people who can't do teach, and people who can't teach gym. That's usually what happens. Now I remember something happened to me about 10 years ago. I was teaching as an adjunct professor of English in a college in downtown New York, and being so miserably underpaid as an adjunct professor, I decided to get my real estate license to make a few bucks on the side, right? Now here I'm doing these two things, and it soon became obvious that the world of real estate, however much we need it or whatever it is, there was such an emptiness, there was such a ennui, there was and in the world of the academic world, even though I was underpaid, the people there were so interesting. You would go to a party and there'd be someone has a PhD in James Joyce. You have a PhD in James Joyce? Man, you dedicated your life to reading Ulysses and this kind of thing. You have something interesting to say, So once there was a party, a real estate party in Tribeca, and I was at this party and I was so excited to go. It was so fancy schmancy condo kind of thing, and there was wine and it was wonderful and all this very excitement. But soon, within about a half hour, I was bored to death. And I'm like, I really have nothing to say to these people. There's nothing really interesting here. I went over to the window, and I looked out the window, and I saw the college. It's Borough Manhattan Community College, where I was teaching. And I almost got this sentimental feeling, like I said, that's my tribe. I belong with those people. I don't care. I got to get out of here. You know, it's going to drive me nuts. But that's my little story that provoked. Michael, what's it like to work with these two interesting, bright young people?
Well, I'd say it's one of the gifts of working here at Arader Galleries. These two and many other colleagues like them. You know, it's for the most part a younger group, and that keeps you fresh. It keeps you challenged. Someone I don't know who it was, said that everyone you meet knows something you don't know, and I'm a big believer in that. And I learn something from these guys every single day I come in here. The other thing is the customers, the clients, the people who buy the things that we sell are really the most interesting people on the planet. You know, these aren't trophies. They're not collecting them, you know, so that they can brag to their friends about how much they spent on a piece of art. They're deeply engaged in the world and in history and in nature, and it's a real pleasure to get to know them. And when we collaborate, which we often do, working together with the same person, as we were just doing this morning, in fact, with the gentleman who came in, then it all comes together, and it's great fun. It's not work at all. It's great.
So we like to see what we do in our show as making dialogue, which is very different than having an interview. We feel that the interview style is like very 20th century, you know, I mean, we love Charlie Rose, you know, he was a great interviewer, you know, but the interviewer goes like this to the subject and puts the subject. The dialogue is very different. One of my heroes was Martin Buber, who wrote a book called I and Thou. He was one of the great philosophers of dialogue, where you show up and you're there, you're present, you're back and forth. So you guys could say whatever you want. You guys could use this opportunity to ask each other questions, to engage with, you know, the audience that's not there, that's there. Hello, audience, we know you're out there. And say, but just to sort of focus it, what is it like to work here? What is a day in the life like, and what is it like being here at the Arader Gallery on Madison Avenue, and how has it changed you or made you different, or? Okay.
It's interesting in that every day pretty much starts out the same, but ends up in a very different place. It's the same in that you're going to a gallery that specializes in certain material, certain subject, certain age. But within those parameters, you can see so many different things and learn about lots of different aspects of history, whether it be natural history or whether it be political history, for instance. You know, you find yourself learning aspects of the mating habits of the Mississippi kite in a way that you might not have expected to at breakfast that morning.
So when you go out to the bar that night, you have something to say, or could that get you in trouble?
It's worked both ways.
Okay. Yes, and the meaning of working here and your experience?
Yeah, just to echo a little bit what Erik said, I just think that you learn something new every day, and there's so much here that we don't necessarily even, like, you know, obviously I'm not familiar with everything, and I know it would take centuries to be to know everything that's here. And it's just like, I remember one day, like, I used to go to the beach in North Carolina, and a client actually told me that the Venus flytrap is native to North Carolina, and then I found that we have a book which is one of the first engravings of the Venus flytrap in North Carolina. And that was just, like, so cool to me, because it's been in my backyard this whole time and I had no idea that it was there. And just, you know, those are the type of things you stumble upon. You didn't really wake up thinking you were going to learn that. And now it's become something like, if a client wants to see an interesting piece of natural history, I'll always show that, because just for me it's interesting. And I think I find that the more we love the material, the more we like to show it, and it becomes kind of like, it's just fun, you know. The clients enjoy seeing things and you enjoy showing them, and that's kind of a really nice reciprocal relationship that I don't know people have in day-to-day work so much.
So just to also educate our audience what this format is like, it's like a salon. We're having a true salon. In a salon, you sort of follow this path. You don't know where it's going to go. It's not like talking points and rigid, it's like a very flowing. So Michael, if you have a thought or a question you want to jump in at any time, let me know, let us know. But I just had a little selfish question that I really wanted to ask Erik, because I've always been a big fan of Americana, to get a clearer definition of what that is. And my passion for Americana was intensified when I met a man named Joe Franklin, who invented the TV talk show as we know it in 1950. He had this Memory Lane show, and maybe before your time, but Joe Franklin was the king of television once in New York. Before Johnny Carson, before David Letterman, it was Joe Franklin. He created the talk show, and we interviewed him. He was a guest on our show. That was a great moment for us, and it was like getting the master, being schooled by the master. But his office in Times Square was just so wonderfully messy. It was like stuff everywhere, and like there's a picture of like Bob Hope from like the 1930s, and he considered himself an expert on 20th century pop culture, but also Americana. And he would go to flea markets, and he would find these things and movie posters, and just his office was like this sort of repository of all this magical stuff. What is Americana, and how did you come to appreciate that?
I think Americana is really simply things that Americans identify with easily. I think that can either be high art, like the Copley portraits, for instance, but it can all the way down to advertising broadsides, cigar store Indians, things like that. Later on into the 20th century, what's that? Is it Hellerware? That right? Or even Pyrex? That's Americana. Think about that. I mean, that's all of these things are out there, and those are, I think, all valid examples of Americana.
We love old movies. Claudia and I were always watching Turner Classic Movies, and as corny and kitschy as they are, there's that aspect of it. And what was it? We were watching Life with Father from the 1940s, starring William Powell and I think it was Irene Dunn. And she's trying to get him to be baptized. He's like this hard-driving, executive type of father living on, I think it was Madison Avenue. And they were trying to get him baptized, and he wouldn't get baptized. And his wife says, "You got to get baptized." He would never baptize, So finally, at the end of the movie, he's going to get baptized. And where do you think they went to get baptized? Audubon Park. So the final scene of this movie, they're in a carriage heading uptown, and then the credits come down, they're heading to Audubon Park, because that's where the minister was. That's Americana, in a way, right?
Absolutely it is. That's a great American tale right there.
So, yeah. I was saying earlier, that I just discovered this new book that came out. I'm not going to say the word on TV. BS Jobs. It's called Jobs That Are Meaningless, jobs where like people push paper back and forth and they hate what they do, but they do it to make a living. You guys do something that is completely the opposite. It's meaningful, it's enriching. What is that like, and how does it feel like in terms of friends maybe who don't have this kind of work? And do you ever feel like you made a mistake? You could be making millions of dollars on Wall Street. What is it like, to dedicate your life to art in that way? Is it a sacrifice, or is it worth it?
I consider myself really lucky to be able to come to a place like this and work every day, both through the material objects that are present on a daily basis, but also through the relationships that one gets to build, whether it be through, as Mike was saying earlier, our colleagues, or whether it be our clientele. It's tough to beat working here.
What are the parties like? I mean, I'm a party guy, right, Claudia? She rolls her eyes. Look like that. She rolls her eyes. Yeah. What are any party stories? Or?
We went for Annie.
Oh, the party stories. I don't know. A lot of people like to rent this place out for different events, just because it's a different background to have. And I think we've seen everyone here, from university presidents to Nobel Peace Prize winners to it kind of spans the gamut. So, you don't get to go somewhere every day and have a bunch of Audubons hanging behind you as a talking point, and I think that is just interesting to have around, and it sparks a lot of conversations, outside of the paper-pushing jobs, maybe. So.
It feels like such a real place in time. It feels a little bit archaic in a wonderful way. And I think in particular nowadays when everybody's online and in this sort of neverland of Facebook and people walk down the street, they're staring at their smartphones, and it's that digital whatever it is, but this is a real place, This is an old place. It's got a richness and texture and history and art and culture, and those are my feelings that I wanted to express. I don't have any questions, but if you have anything to say, yes, okay.
Let me just share a quick story because it relates to what you're asking about, and that is that one of the things that is the most fun about this is when a relatively young person comes into the gallery and is exposed to this material for the first time. And it doesn't happen often. Most of our clientele are older. They're people who have either nurtured an interest in history or have developed an interest in history over time, and so it's led them to maps or the natural history or whatever the aspect is. But every now and then you'll get someone who comes in seeing the material with completely fresh eyes, the same way they see a contemporary art gallery. They don't come in with preconceptions. They come in with a fresh idea. I remember once walking in and there was a young lady standing and looking really intently at the Audubons. And after I let her look for a while, I asked her if she was familiar with them, and she said no, she was from Guadalajara in Mexico. She was in her mid-20s. She said, I've never seen this work before. I'd never been exposed to it. And then she said the greatest thing. She said, the whole life of the bird is in these pictures. And that was a moment, because that when you can really get someone to come in and they just look at this with a fresh look, it's very, very rewarding, and it's a lot of fun.
Wow, it's interesting, too. I read that Audubon wanted to go into mammals toward the end. That's what his new direction was mammals. He did do the mammals? Oh, okay. Oh. I wanted to say how inspired I was, because I was doing a lot of research on Graham in terms of his biography, that he was in boarding school in England and just discovered a map of the town he was in, and that was so fascinating for him that it changed the direction of his life, that one map, and that he has like maps in his bedroom, and it's such a passion following the dream of the map, and being at Yale and just falling in the library, encountering the curator of the Sterling Memorial Library at Yale, and him educating him. And he said it was a very cold winter, the room was cold, but what kept him warm was the enthusiasm he had for the passion of his work. I think this is what a lot of people are missing in their lives, and we think the arts can bring that. The arts can bring that magic, and we're trying with our show to be a vehicle for aesthetic education. And I think education, and I think the art also opens up a realm of possibility. One of my favorite quotes is by Emily Dickinson that says, "Imagination lights the slow fuse of the possible." So I think there's a lot of hopelessness today in the world, right? There's a lot, depression's on the rise. We see things like that. We see Prozac people are taking. Art is a kind of medicine. Is that way? Does that make any sense? Final reflections? We're almost out of time.
Oh, absolutely. I think art is a type of medicine, and it's here to be seen and enjoyed. Welcome people's visit. If they're not feeling well, come see us.
Yes. And final thoughts, reflections. Yeah.
I think absolutely art just helps bring light and everything into you're learning something, you're appreciating something, you're seeing something new, and that's the best thing that we see is when somebody's discovering something, especially because despite the fact that these are like an influential part of American history, a lot of people don't know about a lot of the stuff we have here, so it's kind of a journey of discovery.
Final thoughts.
John, just final thought would be to thank you for including us in your program. This has been very, very exciting for us, and it's great to think of our message getting out there to an audience that you've developed that I'm sure are sympathetic, empathetic, and interested people. So we look forward to meeting some of them.
Well, signing off from the Arader Gallery on Madison Avenue, this magical wonderland that we're just discovering, of aesthetics, of art, of culture, and we're with the crew, we're with the team that makes it happen. And so on behalf of my darling wife, Claudia, we want to thank you. And Claudia's taking our picture now. Yeah, smile. Okay, now we're going to be on Facebook, everybody, okay? So thank you again. We appreciate you spending time with us. Thanks. Okay.